The first time I noticed him, I told myself it was nothing. That's how these things begin, I suppose, not with a loud crash or a clear warning, but with something small, something easy to dismiss, something you can tuck away and pretend didn't happen. I was standing by my kitchen window drying a plate I had already dried twice. The afternoon light had that pale, tired color it gets in early winter. It made everything look a little older than it really was, including me, I think. Across the street, the house had been empty for years, not abandoned exactly, just forgotten. The kind of place people stopped noticing after a while. The paint had peeled into long, curling strips. The garden had turned into a quiet mess of weeds and stubborn bushes. Even the mailbox leaned slightly to one side as if it had given up waiting. I used to glance at it sometimes, out of habit more than curiosity. But that day, something felt different. I don't know what made me look up longer than usual. Maybe it was the stillness. Or maybe it was the feeling, the quiet sense that I wasn't alone even though I should have been. And then I saw him, just a shape really, standing behind the front window. Still, watching, I blinked, thinking it was a trick of the light. A reflection, maybe. My own silhouette caught at the wrong angle, but no, it didn't move when I moved. It stayed there. I remember holding the plate a little tighter than necessary, the edge pressing into my palm. My heart didn't race, not yet, it just shifted. Like something inside me had been gently nudged out of place. After a few seconds, I looked away. That was all it took for me to convince myself I had imagined it. At 65, your mind plays small games sometimes. At least that's what people say, little lapses, little confusions. Nothing serious, so I rinsed the plate again, put it back in the rack, and told myself not to be foolish. My name is Celeste Ellis. I have lived in this house for 32 years, long enough for the walls to remember me. Long enough for the floors to creak in familiar places. Long enough to know the exact sound the front gate makes when someone pushes it open, even just an inch. My husband Dawson built the small bookshelf in the living room himself. It leans slightly to the left, but I never had the heart to fix it. He used to say it gave the room character. I used to tease him that it gave me a headache. Dawson has been gone for 8 years now, not suddenly, not dramatically, just slowly. The kind of leaving that stretches over months until one day the house feels too quiet and you realize the silence has settled in for good. We didn't have children. It wasn't for lack of trying. Life just moved in other directions. We learned to fill our days with smaller joys, morning tea together, quiet evenings with the radio playing something soft in the background, little routines that felt solid and dependable. After he passed, those routines stayed for a while, then one by one they faded. I kept the house. People told me to downsize, to move somewhere more practical. But practicality has never been a good enough reason to leave a life behind, so I stayed. My days became simple. I wake up early before the sun fully rises. Old habit. I make tea in the same chipped blue cup Dawson bought from a roadside stall years ago. I sit by the window, the same window, and watch the street come to life in small, predictable ways. Mrs. Carter walks her dog at exactly 7:30. The mailman hums under his breath when he thinks no one is listening. And the wind moves through the trees in front of the empty house in a way that always sounds like a quiet conversation I can't quite hear. It's a peaceful life. Lonely sometimes. But not in a way that hurts too sharply, more like a dull ache you learn to carry. I didn't see the figure again for a few days, and truthfully I forgot about it. Or maybe I chose to forget. It's easy to ignore things when they don't fit neatly into your understanding of the world, especially when you live alone. Your mind becomes both your companion and your skeptic. But then, it happened again. This time, it was evening. The light had already begun to fade, leaving the street in that soft gray-blue hush that comes just before darkness settles in. I was in the living room, folding laundry I had let sit for too long. There was a stillness in the air that made every sound feel louder than it was. The ticking of the clock, the rustle of fabric, even my own breathing seemed noticeable. I don't know why I looked up, but I did, and there he was again, same window, same position. Standing, watching. This time I didn't look away immediately. I told myself to be sensible, to actually look, to understand what I was seeing instead of running from it. The glass of the window across the street reflected just enough light to make his features unclear. But I could tell it was a man, tall, or at least he seemed tall from the way his shoulders sat. He didn't wave. He didn't move. He just stood there as if he had been waiting. For a moment, just a brief, unsettling moment, I felt as though he knew I would look up at that exact second. That was what made my chest tighten. I set the laundry down carefully, too carefully, as if any sudden movement might draw more attention to me. Then I stepped a little closer to my own window, just a few inches. I wanted to see his face, to confirm he was real, to confirm I wasn't losing something I couldn't afford to lose, but as I leaned forward slightly, he was gone, not walking away, not turning. Gone. The space behind the window was empty again, just darkness and the faint reflection of the sky. I stood there for a long time, long enough for the room to grow colder around me. Long enough for the clock to tick through several minutes that felt like something much heavier. Finally, I pulled the curtains halfway closed. Not completely. I didn't want to admit to myself that I was afraid. That night, I checked the front door twice before going to bed. Then a third time, the lock clicked into place with a finality that should have comforted me, but as I lay there staring at the ceiling, I couldn't shake the feeling that something had shifted. Something quiet, something patient, and for the first time in many years. My home didn't feel entirely mine. The next morning, I told myself I would go about my day as usual, because that's what you do when something unsettles you at my age. You don't panic, you don't jump to conclusions, you make your tea, you open your curtains. And you face whatever is there or is. But as my hand reached for the fabric, I hesitated, just for a second, just long enough for a thought to form. What if he's already there, watching, waiting for me to look? I don't know why that thought felt heavier than the others, but it did, and slowly, very slowly, I pulled the curtain aside. The curtain slid open with a soft, familiar whisper. For a moment, I didn't breathe. I kept my eyes low at first, just enough to let the morning light touch the room without fully committing to what might be waiting outside. The kind of hesitation that doesn't belong to fear exactly, but to something quieter, something more uncertain. Then slowly I lifted my gaze. The house across the street looked exactly as it always had. Still, empty. The window where I had seen him stood dull and lifeless, reflecting nothing but the pale sky and the outline of the old oak tree beside it. No shadow, no movement. No trace of anyone standing behind the glass. I let out a breath I hadn't realized I was holding. You see, that is how doubt works. It doesn't come all at once. It settles in gently, offering you a more comfortable version of reality, one where nothing is wrong. One where everything can still be explained. I told myself quite firmly that I had imagined it. Twice. Perhaps I had been tired, or distracted, or simply too used to silence to the point where my mind had begun filling it with things that weren't there. At 65, you learn to question yourself before you question the world. So I turned away from the window. I made my tea. I followed my routine with careful precision, as though each small, ordinary action could anchor me back into something stable. But even then, something remained. A small, quiet awareness at the edge of my thoughts, like the feeling of being watched even when you're alone. That afternoon, I decided to step outside, not because I needed anything, not groceries, not fresh air, not even a walk. But because staying inside suddenly felt heavier than usual, as if the walls, which had always comforted me, had begun to listen a little too closely. I put on my light cardigan, the beige one with the worn sleeves, and stepped onto the front porch. The air was cool, carrying the faint scent of damp earth and distant cooking. Somewhere down the street, a radio played an old song I recognized but couldn't quite name. Everything felt normal, and yet I found myself looking across the street again. The house stood there, quiet and unmoving. But now I saw it differently, not as a forgotten place, but as a place that might not be empty after all. I hesitated at the edge of my porch. It would have been easy to walk across, to stand in front of it, to knock on the door and settle the matter in a single, simple moment. But I didn't, because something about that idea felt intrusive, not dangerous, not exactly, just wrong. Instead, I turned and walked down the path toward the sidewalk. I told myself I would take a short walk. Clear my head, let the morning's unease drift away the way it usually did, and for a while, it worked. I passed Mrs. Carter and her small, stubborn dog. She gave me a warm smile, the kind that comes from years of shared, quiet familiarity. "Morning, Celeste," she said, adjusting her scarf. "You're out a bit earlier than usual." "Couldn't sit still today," I replied, returning her smile. She nodded as if that explained everything. And perhaps it did. We exchanged a few more polite words before parting ways, nothing unusual, nothing worth remembering. And yet, as I continued down the street, I felt it again, that same subtle awareness. That same quiet sense that I was not entirely alone. I resisted the urge to turn around immediately. There's a kind of pride that comes with age. A refusal to appear unsettled even when something inside you shifts. But after a few more steps, I gave in. I turned, slowly, carefully, and there it was again, not the man, but the house and the window. From this angle it looked darker, less reflective. As if the glass itself had thickened somehow, hiding whatever might be behind it. I stood there longer than I should have, long enough for a passing car to slow slightly, the driver glancing at me with mild curiosity. I looked away and continued walking. That evening I made a decision, not a dramatic one, not the kind that changes everything at once, just a small, quiet decision. I would pay closer attention. If there was someone in that house, I would notice. If there was, then I would prove it to myself. I set my chair by the window before sunset, not directly in front of it, that would have felt too obvious, but at an angle where I could see the house without being fully exposed. The room dimmed slowly as the light faded. The ticking of the clock grew louder in the quiet, and I waited. Time moves differently when you're watching for something. Minutes stretch, seconds become noticeable. Every small sound, the creak of wood, the distant bark of a dog, the hum of a passing car feels like it might mean something. I kept my eyes on the house, on that window, and for a long while nothing happened. I began to feel foolish again, sitting there watching an empty building like it held some kind of answer. I almost stood up, almost told myself this had gone far enough, but then there it was, movement, so slight I almost missed it. A shift behind the glass, a dark shape forming. My body went still, not tense, not panicked, just still. The way you become when something inside you understands that this moment matters. The shape grew clearer, a figure. Standing exactly where I had seen him before. Watching. This time I didn't look away, and this time neither did he. The distance between us felt different now, not just physical, intentional, as if this wasn't accidental anymore, as if it had never been. I leaned forward slightly, my hands resting on the arms of the chair, trying to see more, trying to understand, but the light was too low. His face remained hidden. Only the outline, the presence remained. And then he moved, not much, just enough to raise his arm, slowly, deliberately. My breath caught, not because the movement was threatening, but because it felt deliberate, directed at me. His hand reached the level of his chest, and then it stopped. No wave, no signal, just a stillness, as if he were holding something or about to. I felt a chill move through me, subtle but undeniable. This wasn't imagination. This wasn't coincidence. This was something else. And for the first time, a question formed that I could not easily dismiss. Why me? Why this house? Why now? I stood up, my movements slower than usual, careful. Measured, as if I were afraid that moving too quickly might change something I didn't yet understand. I took a step closer to the window, then another. My reflection began to overlap with the view outside, making it harder to see him clearly, so I reached out and touched the glass. The cool surface grounded me just enough, and as I leaned slightly to the side, the figure vanished again, gone, as if he had never been there. I stared at the empty window, my heart now beating just a little faster than before, not wildly. Not out of control, but enough to remind me that something real had just happened. Something I could no longer explain away. I closed the curtains fully this time, not halfway, not hesitantly, completely, and as the room fell into darkness, I stood there for a moment, listening, waiting. Half expecting to hear something, a knock, a sound, anything, but there was only silence, deep and unbroken. That night I didn't sleep well, not because I was afraid of what might happen, but because I couldn't stop thinking about what already had, the figure, the stillness. The way he had stood there as if he belonged. And beneath all of that, one quiet, persistent thought: this wasn't random. This was intentional, and somehow it involved me. The next morning I didn't wait, I didn't hesitate at the curtain, I opened it fully, directly. As if I were done pretending, the house stood there unchanged, but something inside me had shifted. I was no longer just observing, I was involved. And for the first time since this began, I knew one thing with certainty: I wasn't going to ignore it anymore. That morning I didn't make tea right away. That may sound like a small thing, but when you live alone for long enough, your routines become a kind of quiet structure, a way of holding the day together. And when one of those pieces shifts, even slightly, you feel it. Instead, I stood at the window, not watching nervously, not searching desperately, just present. The house across the street looked as it always did, still, worn, holding its silence like a secret it had grown comfortable keeping. but I no longer saw it as empty. There's a difference between an empty place and a place that is simply quiet, and I had begun to understand that difference. I folded my arms loosely, more out of habit than intention, and let my eyes rest on the front door of that house. Closed, unmoving, unremarkable. If someone were inside, they had not come out, or perhaps they had and I simply hadn't noticed. That thought stayed with me longer than I expected. At 65, you learn to trust your awareness in certain ways. You notice things, small things. The rhythm of your street, the patterns of your neighbors, the quiet consistency of everyday life. And yet, I had not seen anyone enter or leave that house. Not once. Which meant one of two things. Either I had missed something, or someone had been there longer than I realized. I finally made my tea. The kettle whistled a little louder than usual, or perhaps I was just listening more closely. The sound echoed through the kitchen, sharp and clear, breaking the quiet in a way that felt almost intrusive. I poured the water carefully, watching the steam rise in thin, twisting lines. For a moment, I allowed myself to focus on that. The simple things, the familiar things, but even then my attention drifted back to the window. I carried my cup to the small table beside it and sat down. The chair creaked softly beneath me, and I waited, not for something specific, just waited. By late morning, the street had settled into its usual rhythm. Cars passed occasionally, voices carried faintly from down the block. A delivery truck stopped briefly, then moved on. Everything felt ordinary, and yet beneath that ordinariness something continued to hum quietly. A sense of anticipation, not sharp, not urgent, but present. I found myself studying the house more carefully now. Details I had ignored for years began to stand out. The curtains inside were not as still as I remembered. Once, just briefly, I thought I saw them shift, just a fraction, as if brushed by something from within. I leaned forward slightly, narrowing my eyes, but the movement didn't repeat. The fabric hung still again. And once more, doubt tried to return. You see, the mind has a way of protecting itself. It offers you explanations that are easier to live with. The wind, the light, your imagination. But this time I didn't accept them so easily, because I had seen him, more than once. And whatever this was, it wasn't nothing. Around noon, there was a knock at my door. It startled me more than it should have. Not because the sound was loud, but because I had become so focused on what was across the street that I had forgotten about what was right in front of me. I set my cup down and stood slowly. The floorboards beneath my feet gave their familiar, quiet complaints. As I walked toward the door, I felt that same small awareness again, that sense of being observed. I paused for just a moment, then opened it. It was Mrs. Carter. She stood there with her usual gentle posture, her scarf wrapped neatly, her small dog sitting patiently beside her. "Celeste," she said, offering a warm, slightly concerned smile. "I hope I'm not disturbing you." "Not at all," I replied. "I was just sitting." She nodded, though her eyes lingered on my face a moment longer than usual. "I made a bit too much soup this morning," she said, lifting a small container. "Thought you might like some." "That's very kind of you." I stepped aside to let her in. The dog followed quietly, its nails tapping softly against the floor. We moved into the kitchen and I placed the container on the counter. "It smells wonderful," I said, though I hadn't opened it yet. She smiled, but there was something else in her expression now, a hesitation. "Have you been sleeping well?" she asked gently. The question caught me off guard. "Well enough," I said. "Why do you ask?" She adjusted her scarf slightly, her gaze shifting for a moment. "I thought I saw you up quite late last night," she said. "Your light was on." I nodded slowly. "Yes, I couldn't quite settle." She studied me again as if deciding whether to say more, and then quietly she did. "You know," she said, lowering her voice just a little, "I've noticed something across the street." My chest tightened, not sharply, but enough. "What do you mean?" I asked, keeping my tone even. She glanced toward the window. "That house," she said. "I thought I saw a light in there last night." The room felt smaller suddenly. "Are you sure?" I asked. She gave a small shrug. "Perhaps not," she admitted. It was late. "And my eyes aren't what they used to be." I let out a soft breath. "Yes, it's easy to mistake things in the dark." She nodded, but neither of us sounded entirely convinced. There was a quiet pause between us, the kind that carries more than words. And then she reached out, placing her hand gently over mine. "If something feels off, Celeste," she said softly, "you don't have to ignore it." I met her gaze. There was no alarm there, no fear, just understanding, and that somehow made everything feel more real. "Thank you," I said. She gave my hand a small squeeze, then stepped back. "I'll leave you to your afternoon," she said, her tone returning to its usual warmth. I walked her to the door, watched as she made her way back down the path. And as she reached the sidewalk, I saw it. Her head turned just slightly toward the house across the street. She didn't stop, she didn't linger, but she noticed, just as I had. That evening, I didn't sit by the window, not immediately. Instead, I moved through the house more deliberately, checking things I hadn't thought about in years. The back door, the windows in the spare room, the small latch on the kitchen door, everything was as it should be, locked, secure, familiar. And yet, I couldn't shake the feeling that something had shifted beyond the walls of my home, something that wasn't bound by locks or latches. When I finally returned to the living room, the light outside had already begun to fade. I stood there for a moment, looking at the closed curtains, and then I opened them, slowly, carefully. The house across the street stood in the dimming light, still, quiet, but no longer distant. It felt connected to me now, in a way I didn't yet understand. I stepped closer to the glass, waited, and then there it was again, the figure, clearer this time, standing in the same place, watching, but something had changed, something subtle but unmistakable. The front door of the house, it wasn't closed anymore, it stood slightly ajar. Just enough to reveal a thin line of darkness inside. My breath stilled, because I knew without needing to tell myself that door had not been open before, and now it was. The door stayed open, not wide, not welcoming, just slightly, enough to be noticed, enough to feel intentional. I stood there longer than I should have, my hand resting lightly against the edge of the curtain. The fabric felt rough beneath my fingers, familiar in a way that grounded me, but not enough to quiet the unease that had begun to settle deeper inside my chest. Across the street, the figure remained at the window, still, watching, and now with the door open behind him, the house no longer looked abandoned. It looked occupied. That word changed everything, because an empty house is something you can explain. But an occupied one, without movement, without sound, without any sign of ordinary life, feels different. It feels deliberate. I swallowed slowly and stepped back from the window, not out of fear exactly, but out of instinct. There are moments in life when something shifts from being observed to observing you in return, and I had crossed that line. That night, I didn't close the curtains. I thought about it. I even reached for them once, but something stopped me. Perhaps it was pride. Or perhaps it was something quieter, a refusal to hide in my own home. So I left them open. And I sat in the dim light of the living room, the small lamp beside me casting a soft glow that barely reached the window. From where I sat, I could still see the house. The open door, the dark interior, but the figure had disappeared. At some point between my stepping away and returning, he was no longer there, and that absence felt just as heavy as his presence had. Because now I didn't know where he was. Inside, near the door, watching from somewhere I couldn't see, that uncertainty settled into me in a way that was difficult to ignore. I kept my eyes on the house for as long as I could. Minutes passed, then more. The street grew quieter. The sounds of the neighborhood softened one by one until there was little left but the distant hum of something far away and the steady ticking of my clock. And still nothing moved. Eventually, exhaustion found me. Not the kind that comes from physical effort, but the kind that comes from holding your attention too tightly for too long. I turned off the lamp. The room fell into darkness, broken only by the faint light filtering in from outside. And as I made my way to bed, I told myself firmly that I would deal with this in the morning, that there would be a reasonable explanation, that there always is. But sleep did not come easily. It arrived in fragments, short, uneven stretches that never quite settled. And in those quiet spaces between waking and sleeping, my mind returned to the same image. The open door, the still figure, the sense that something had begun and had not yet finished. At some point in the night, I woke fully. No sound had stirred me, no obvious reason. Just a feeling. The room was dark, still, and for a moment I lay there listening, nothing, no footsteps, no voices, no movement. But then slowly I turned my head toward the window. The curtains were still open. And from my bed I could just see the outline of the house across the street. The door, it was still open. My chest tightened slightly because that meant something. It meant no one had closed it. No one had come or gone. Or if they had, I hadn't heard it. I sat up slowly, carefully, as if any sudden movement might disturb the fragile quiet of the moment, and then, without fully deciding to, I stood. I walked toward the window. Each step felt louder than it should have, the floorboards beneath me echoing softly in the silence. When I reached the glass, I paused, just for a second, and then I looked. The house stood as it had before, the door open, the darkness inside unchanged, but then something else. A light, faint, deep within the house, not at the front, further back. As if coming from a room I couldn't see directly, I leaned closer, narrowing my eyes. The light flickered slightly, not like a television, not steady, more like a lamp or a single bulb. And as I watched, a shadow moved across it. My breath caught, not sharply, but enough. Because this time there was no doubt, someone was inside, moving, living, existing in a space that had, until recently, been nothing more than a forgotten part of my street. I stepped back from the window, my mind already trying to catch up with what I was seeing. If someone had moved in, why hadn't I seen them arrive? Why no moving truck, no noise, no sign of change, and more importantly, why stand at the window like that? Why watch? The next morning I didn't wait. I dressed quickly, simple clothes, nothing unusual, but my movements carried a different kind of intention now. I wasn't going to sit and observe anymore. I wasn't going to wait for something to reveal itself. I was going to go across the street. The decision settled into me quietly, without drama, without hesitation. I stepped outside, the cool air brushing against my face. The street looked the same, familiar, unchanged. And yet, as I walked toward that house, each step felt heavier than the last. Not because I was afraid, but because I knew, in a way I couldn't quite explain, that something important was about to happen. Something that would shift things in a way I couldn't undo. I reached the edge of the street and paused. Looking up at the house from this distance felt different. Closer, more real, the peeling paint, the uneven steps leading up to the door, the slight sway of the mailbox, details I had seen for years now felt sharper, more defined. The front door, it was closed again, completely. As if it had never been open at all. I stared at it for a moment, a long moment. Because I knew what I had seen, I knew it had been open, and now it was. That quiet contradiction unsettled me more than anything else so far. But I didn't turn back. Instead, I crossed the street, each step deliberate, measured, until I stood at the base of the small path leading to the door. The air felt different here, stiller, heavier, as if the house carried its own quiet atmosphere. I walked up the path. The ground beneath my feet slightly uneven, and when I reached the door I stopped. Up close it looked older than I expected. The wood worn, the paint chipped, the handle dull with age. I raised my hand, and for a moment I hesitated, not out of fear, but out of awareness. Once I knocked, there would be no going back to not knowing. And then, gently, I knocked. The sound echoed softly against the door, then faded. I waited, no response. I knocked again, a little firmer this time. The silence that followed felt longer, thicker. And then a sound from inside, soft, measured footsteps, slowly approaching. My hand lowered to my side, my breath steady but deeper now. The handle turned, carefully, deliberately. And as the door began to open, I felt something inside me shift. Not fear, not panic, but recognition, as if somehow this moment had been waiting for me. The door opened just enough to reveal a face. A man, older, his eyes met mine, and for a second neither of us spoke. Then quietly, "I was wondering when you would come," he said. "I was wondering when you would come." His voice was calm, not surprised, not cautious, just certain. For a moment I didn't respond. I stood there on the worn wooden step looking at a man I had never seen before, and yet something in his tone suggested that he knew me, not in a vague, neighborly way. Not as someone who had simply noticed me across the street. No, there was recognition in it, and that unsettled me more than anything else. "I'm sorry," I said finally, my voice steady but quiet. "Do I know you?" He studied my face for a moment, not rudely, not intensely, just carefully, as if comparing something in front of him to something he already carried in his mind. Then he opened the door a little wider. "You should come in," he said. It wasn't a command. It wasn't even a request. It felt more like the next step in something that had already begun. I hesitated. Of course I did. At 65, you don't walk into a stranger's house without thinking twice. You don't ignore the quiet instincts that have kept you safe for years. But there was no threat in his posture, no urgency, no pressure, and more than that, there was a question inside me that had grown too large to leave unanswered. So I nodded just slightly and stepped inside. The air was different immediately, not stale as I had expected. Not dusty, there was a faint scent of something familiar, old wood perhaps, and something softer beneath it. Like linen that had been stored carefully for a long time. The entryway was dim, lit only by a small lamp somewhere deeper in the house. I paused just inside the door as he closed it behind me. The sound of the latch settling into place was soft but final. I turned slowly, taking in the space. The house was not empty, not at all. It was lived in, but not in the way I expected. There were no scattered belongings, no signs of recent movement or clutter. Everything was arranged with a kind of quiet precision. A small table stood against the wall, holding a neatly folded cloth. A chair sat beside it, perfectly aligned. Even the floor, though worn, was clean. It felt less like a home in progress and more like a home preserved. "You've been watching me," I said. I didn't phrase it as a question. He didn't deny it. "Yes," he said simply. I let that settle between us. "Why?" He didn't answer immediately. Instead, he walked past me, gesturing lightly for me to follow. I did. The hallway opened into a modest living room, and that was where I stopped, because suddenly something in my chest shifted. The room felt familiar, not exactly, not clearly, but in a way that made my breath pause for just a moment. There was a chair near the window, a small table beside it, and on that table a cup, blue, chipped at the edge. My eyes narrowed slightly. No, not the same one, but close enough. Too close. I stepped further into the room, my gaze moving slowly across the details. The arrangement, the placement of things, even the way the light fell through the window. It reminded me of something, or rather, of somewhere. Behind me, the man spoke. "I hoped you would notice." I turned to him. "What is this?" I asked quietly. He didn't look uncomfortable. He didn't look defensive. If anything, he looked tired, not physically, but in a way that comes from carrying something for a long time. "My name is Phoenix," he said. I waited. He took a slow breath, then continued. "I moved here 3 weeks ago." 3 weeks. That explained the absence of obvious movement, the quiet, the stillness, but it didn't explain the rest. "I didn't see anyone move in," I said. "I made sure of that." The answer came gently, but it carried weight. "Why?" I asked. He looked at me then directly, and for the first time I saw something shift in his expression. Not guilt, not fear, but something closer to uncertainty. "Because I didn't want to disturb you." The words landed softly, but they didn't make sense. "Disturb me?" I repeated. He nodded. "Yes." A silence followed, not empty, but full of things unsaid. I took a step closer. "I don't understand," I said, and I meant it. Nothing about this felt random anymore. Not the watching, not the house, not the way he spoke. It all felt connected, but I couldn't see how. Phoenix moved toward the chair near the window and rested his hand lightly on its back. "This house," he said slowly, "used to belong to someone." I waited. He glanced at the room as if measuring his words against the space around him. "Someone who lived here a long time ago." A quiet breath left me. "Yes, I remember," I said. "An older woman, she passed years back." He nodded. "My mother." The words settled into the room with a quiet finality. I felt something shift again, not shock, but alignment, a piece of something falling into place. "I didn't know she had family," I said. "She didn't talk about us much," he replied. There was no bitterness in his tone. "Just fact, I hadn't been back here in years," he continued. "Not until recently." I watched him carefully now. Every word felt deliberate, every pause intentional. "And when I came back," he said, "I found something." My breath slowed. "What?" He looked at me again. And this time there was no hesitation. "Letters." The word lingered. Something about it stirred a faint, distant feeling in me, a memory I couldn't quite reach. "Letters?" I asked. He nodded. "In a box, hidden away." A quiet unease began to form. Letters from who? He didn't answer immediately. Instead, he reached into the drawer of the small table beside the chair. He pulled something out, carefully, a stack of envelopes, worn, faded, but preserved. And as he held them out toward me, my hands hesitated, because before I even touched them, I knew. Not clearly, not completely, but enough. I took one, slowly. The paper felt familiar beneath my fingers, the texture, the weight, and when I turned it over, my breath caught, not sharply, but deeply. Because the handwriting was mine, the envelope trembled slightly in my hand. Not enough for anyone else to notice, but enough for me to feel it. That quiet, unmistakable tremor that comes when something inside you recognizes the truth before your mind has fully caught up. I didn't open it, not yet. I simply stared at the handwriting, my handwriting. Softer than it used to be, perhaps, a little more careful, but undeniably mine. And suddenly something long buried began to shift. Not a clear memory, not a complete picture, just fragments. A table, a pen, late evenings, and a feeling I hadn't allowed myself to revisit in years. I don't understand, I said, my voice quieter now, but even as I spoke, I knew the words weren't entirely true, because a part of me was beginning to understand. Phoenix watched me carefully, not impatiently, not expectantly, just present. You wrote them, he said gently. I let out a slow breath. Yes, I replied. I can see that, but not to me. I looked up at him. Then who? I asked. He hesitated. And for the first time since I had entered the house, I saw something like vulnerability in his face. To my mother, he said. The room seemed to shift slightly around me, not physically, but in the way a space changes when something important is finally spoken aloud. I lowered my gaze back to the envelope. The edges were worn, handled, kept, not discarded, not forgotten, carefully preserved. Why? I asked softly. It was a simple question, but it carried years within it. Phoenix exhaled slowly as if he had been waiting for that moment. She kept them, he said. All of them? I swallowed. How many? Dozens? The word landed heavier than I expected. Dozens? That wasn't a passing exchange. That wasn't something casual or insignificant. That was time. That was intention. That was something I had lived and then somehow left behind. I don't remember writing them, I said, and this time it was the truth, not entirely at least. There were pieces. Feelings, but not the full shape of it. Phoenix nodded. I thought that might be the case. I looked at him again. Why? He stepped a little closer, though he kept a respectful distance. Because the last one, he said carefully, was never answered. The words settled into me slowly, like something sinking through water. The last one never answered. And just like that, the fragments began to connect. Not all at once, but enough. A memory surfaced, faint but steady, sitting by my own window years ago, before Dawson had grown ill. Before life had narrowed into quiet routines, writing, folding paper carefully, addressing envelopes, and sending them across the street. My breath deepened. She didn't reply, I said. It wasn't a question. Phoenix shook his head. No. A silence followed, not uncomfortable, but full. I thought she didn't want to, I continued. My voice felt distant to my own ears, as if I had overstepped. Phoenix studied me. She wanted to, he said. I looked up. What do you mean? He hesitated again. Then reached for one of the envelopes in his hand. He opened it carefully and pulled out a folded sheet. The paper was aged, but intact. He handed it to me. This isn't yours, he said. It's hers. I took it slowly. The paper felt fragile, important. I unfolded it with care, and there it was. Handwriting I didn't recognize immediately, but steady, measured, thoughtful. I began to read. Celeste, I have read every word you've sent me more than once, sometimes in the morning light. Sometimes late at night when the house feels too quiet to hold all my thoughts. You speak of loneliness in a way that feels honest, and I understand it more than you may realize, but there are things I have not told you. Not because I do not trust you, but because I am afraid that if I do, I will change the nature of what we have built through these letters. There is a difference between being known and being seen too clearly. And I am not certain I am ready for the latter. Still, I am grateful for you, for your words, for your presence even from across the street. Perhaps one day I will gather the courage to knock on your door instead of waiting for your letters to arrive at mine. Until then, I remain here. Elinor, my hands stilled, the name lingered in my mind. Elinor, yes, now I remembered, not clearly at first. But enough, she had been quiet, private, a woman who kept to herself. We had never spoken directly, not once. And yet we had written for how long, months, years, I couldn't say, but it had mattered, that much I could feel. I waited for her, I said slowly. The words came from somewhere deeper now. I thought she would come. Phoenix nodded. She wanted to. A faint ache moved through me. Then why didn't she? He lowered his gaze slightly. She became ill, he said, not long after writing that. The room felt still again. He continued. She never sent it. I looked back at the letter in my hands, the careful words, the quiet honesty left unsent, unfinished. And I stopped writing, I said, not as a question, but as a realization. Phoenix met my gaze again. Yes. A long silence followed, this one heavier, because now the shape of it was clear, not completely but enough. Two people, living across from each other, reaching out but never quite meeting, and then time, life, illness, silence. I exhaled slowly, folding the letter with care. I thought she didn't care, I said, and she thought she couldn't say enough. The words settled between us, not as blame, not as regret, just truth. I looked around the room again, the arrangement, the chair, the small details that had felt familiar before. You recreated this, I said. Phoenix nodded, as best as I could. Why? He took a moment before answering. Because I read your letters, he said, all of them. I felt a slight shift inside me, not discomfort, but awareness. And in them, he continued, you described your life, your routines, the way you sat by the window, the way you arranged your space. I listened quietly. I wanted to understand her, he said, and you were part of that. I held his gaze, and watching me. I asked, this time he didn't hesitate. I didn't know how to approach you, he said, not at first. His honesty was disarming. I didn't want to reopen something painful, he continued, or arrive with questions you might not want to answer, so you watched. Yes. The simplicity of it made it harder to argue with, but it didn't make it easier to accept. You could have knocked, I said. I know, he replied, a pause, but I wasn't sure if I had the right. I considered that. And in a quiet, unexpected way, I understood it. Because sometimes the past doesn't feel like something you can walk back into without permission, even when it belongs to you. I looked down at the letter one more time, then back at him. You said the last one wasn't answered, I said. He nodded. I took a slow breath. Then perhaps it still can be. Then perhaps it still can be. The words left my mouth before I had fully measured them. But once spoken, they settled into the room with a quiet certainty. Phoenix didn't respond immediately. He watched me the way one does when something unexpected but meaningful has just been offered, not with surprise exactly, but with a kind of careful attention. You mean answer it now? He asked. I nodded, yes. My voice felt steadier than I expected because something inside me had shifted. Not suddenly, not dramatically, but enough to make the path ahead feel clearer. For years, I had carried a quiet misunderstanding, a belief that something I had offered had not been wanted. And so I had let it go, closed that small, unfinished part of my life without realizing that it had never truly been closed at all. But now here it was again, not as it had been, but as something waiting, still, patient. I think it deserves an answer, I said softly. Phoenix lowered his gaze for a moment, then nodded. I think she would have liked that. The simplicity of his response carried more weight than anything else he could have said. I looked down at the letter in my hands. Eleanor's words, careful, measured, honest in a way that felt both distant and deeply personal at the same time. There was no demand in them, no expectation, just presence. And suddenly I understood something I hadn't before. She hadn't needed a reply to continue. She had simply hoped. I folded the letter again and handed it back to Phoenix. May I asked, gesturing slightly toward the room. He nodded immediately, of course. I moved slowly, taking in the space with a different awareness now, not as a stranger, not even as a guest, but as someone who had unknowingly been part of this house long before stepping inside it. The chair by the window drew my attention again. I walked toward it. The floor creaked softly beneath my steps, and when I reached it, I paused. There is something about sitting in a place that holds memory, even if the memory isn't entirely yours. Even if it belongs to someone else who once sat in the same quiet, thinking their own thoughts, carrying their own feelings. I lowered myself into the chair. It felt right. Not comfortable exactly, but fitting, as if the moment had found its place. The window in front of me framed the street, and across it my own house. I let out a slow breath, so this is what she had seen, day after day, the same view, the same distance. And somewhere within that distance, she had found connection. Through paper, through words, through something that never quite crossed the space between us. Until now, Phoenix remained a few steps away, giving me space without needing to say it. Do you have paper? I asked. Yes. He moved quietly to the table and returned with a small stack of paper and a pen. I took them carefully. The pen felt light in my hand, familiar, and yet it had been a long time since I had written something that mattered this way. I placed the paper on the table beside me. For a moment I didn't write. I simply sat, looking out the window, letting the weight of the moment settle. Because this wasn't just about answering a letter. It was about answering something I had left unfinished, something I had misunderstood. And perhaps something I had avoided without realizing it. Finally, I lowered the pen to the paper and began. Eleanor, I don't know if this letter will ever reach you in the way it was meant to. But I am writing it anyway because there are things that should not remain unfinished simply because time has passed. I received your words today, years later than either of us intended, and yet they felt as if they had been waiting patiently for this moment. You spoke of the difference between being known and being seen too clearly. I understand that now more than I did then. I think perhaps we both stood at the edge of something we didn't quite know how to step into. I waited for you. And when you didn't come, I told myself it was because you didn't wish to, that it was easier that way. But now I know the truth was quieter than that, more human, and I find that I do not feel regret in the way I expected to. Only a kind of gentle understanding. We were there, both of us, in our own ways, reaching across a distance neither of us quite knew how to close, and perhaps that was enough. Still, I would have liked to meet you, to sit in this room. To share a cup of tea, to let our words exist in the same space instead of traveling back and forth between us. But life does not always give us the moments we imagine. So instead, I offer this gratitude for your letters, for your honesty, for your presence even when it remained unseen, and wherever you are now, I hope you found the courage you spoke of. Celeste, I finished writing and sat still for a moment. The room felt quieter now, not empty, but settled. As if something that had been waiting had finally been given its place. I set the pen down gently and looked at the page one last time. There was no perfect ending, no grand resolution, just completion. I folded the letter carefully, then turned to Phoenix. He stepped closer. His eyes moved over the envelope in my hand, though he didn't reach for it immediately. "Thank you," he said. I shook my head slightly. "It wasn't for you," I replied gently. "I know." A small silence passed between us, not uncomfortable, just reflective. "What will you do with it?" I asked. He considered the question. "I'll keep it with the others," he said. "Where she kept yours?" I nodded. That felt right. A quiet continuation of something that had once existed, even if the people involved had changed. I stood slowly from the chair. The room looked different now, not unfamiliar, but no longer uncertain, as if its purpose had shifted, or perhaps been fulfilled. "I think I understand now," I said. Phoenix tilted his head slightly. "Understand what?" I looked toward the window, toward my house. "Why you were watching," I said. He didn't interrupt. "Not to disturb," I continued, "but to find something you weren't sure how to approach." He gave a small, thoughtful nod. "That's true." I met his gaze again. "You could have come sooner," I said. "I know. But then I might not have been ready to answer." That seemed to settle something in him and perhaps in me as well. We walked back toward the door together. This time the space between us felt different, not unfamiliar, not uncertain, just understood. As he opened the door, the afternoon light spilled in softly. The street looked as it always had, but something inside me had changed, not dramatically, not visibly, but enough. I stepped out onto the porch, paused, and then turned back. "Phoenix," I said. "Yes. If you ever feel like knocking, you don't have to wait." A small, genuine warmth appeared in his expression. "I'll remember that." I nodded, then made my way back across the street, each step lighter than before, not because everything had been resolved, but because something that had once been unclear had finally found its shape. And for the first time in many years, the distance between that house and mine no longer felt like something unfinished. That evening, I made my tea the way I always had. The kettle warmed slowly. The soft whistle rose and faded. Steam curled into the quiet air of the kitchen, catching the light just enough to make it visible before disappearing again. Everything was the same, and yet it was. I carried the cup to my chair by the window, sat down. And for the first time in days, I didn't feel the need to watch. I still looked, of course. Old habits don't disappear so quickly, but my gaze was different now. Softer, less searching. The house across the street stood as it always had, worn, still, quiet. But no longer mysterious, no longer something to be solved, just another place, another life, another story that had crossed mine in a way neither of us had expected. The window where I had first seen him reflected the fading light of the evening, empty. Or perhaps simply no longer needing to be filled. I took a slow sip of my tea. It tasted the same as always, but there was a small, quiet comfort in that, because not everything had changed, only what needed to. The days that followed settled into a rhythm that felt both familiar and gently altered. I still woke early, still sat by the window, still noticed the small patterns of the street, the way Mrs. Carter adjusted her scarf before stepping outside, the way the mailman hummed as he walked. But now there was something else, a presence that no longer felt distant. Phoenix didn't stand at the window anymore, at least not in the way he had before. Instead, I saw him outside, once tending to the overgrown garden. His movements were slow, thoughtful, as if he were learning the space rather than trying to change it too quickly. Another time he stood by the mailbox examining it with quiet focus before straightening it slightly. Small things, ordinary things, but they carried a kind of meaning. Because they spoke of someone choosing to remain, choosing to build something however quietly. A few days later there was a knock at my door. This time it didn't startle me, I knew who it would be, I opened it. And there he stood, not uncertain, not hesitant, just present. "I thought I might take you up on that offer," he said. I stepped aside. "Of course." He entered with a quiet respect for the space, not looking around too much, not imposing. Just stepping into it carefully as if aware that this house held its own history as well. I led him to the living room, the same chair, the same table, the same small details that had remained unchanged for years. "Tea?" I asked. He gave a small nod. "Yes, thank you." I moved into the kitchen. The familiar rhythm of preparing tea felt grounding, comforting, and as I poured the water I realized something simple but important. This was the moment Alina had once imagined, not exactly as she had written it. Not with her sitting across from me, but close enough to carry the same quiet meaning. When I returned, Phoenix was standing by the window, looking out, at his house, at mine, at the space between. "It looks different from here," he said. "Yes," I replied, setting the cup down. "It always does." He turned slightly, taking the tea with a quiet nod of thanks. We sat, not across from each other, but at a gentle angle, the kind that allows conversation without forcing it. For a while we didn't speak much. And that was all right, because not every silence needs to be filled. Some are simply shared. Eventually he spoke. "I've been reading them again," he said. "The letters." I nodded. "They feel different now," he continued. "How?" He considered the question. "Less like something unfinished," he said. "More like something that found its way eventually." I understood that because I felt it too. "They were never really about answers," I said. "Not entirely." He looked at me. "Then what were they about?" I took a moment. "Let the question settle." "Connection," I said finally. "Even if it remained incomplete." He nodded slowly. "Yes, that sounds right." We fell into quiet again, but this time it felt full, not with questions, not with uncertainty, just with presence. Weeks passed, then months, and life continued, not dramatically. Not in ways that would stand out to anyone passing by, but in small, steady changes. Phoenix restored parts of the house slowly, not to erase its past, but to preserve it. The garden found shape again. The windows were cleaned. The door once left slightly open, now closed with a quiet certainty each evening. And sometimes we would share tea, not every day, not even every week, but enough to create something new, something that didn't replace what had been but didn't ignore it either. Mrs. Carter noticed, of course. She always did. "Nice to see that house alive again," she said one morning as we stood by the sidewalk. "Yes," I replied, "it is." She looked at me with a knowing softness. "And you?" she asked gently. "Are you sleeping better?" I smiled slightly. "Yes," I said, "I am." And it was true, because the quiet in my house had changed, not in volume, not in presence, but in meaning. It no longer felt like something missing, just something at rest. One afternoon, as I sat by the window, I noticed something I hadn't expected. A small movement across the street. Phoenix, standing by his window, not watching in the way he once had, not still, not hidden, just there. For a brief moment our eyes met. And this time there was no question in it, no uncertainty, just recognition. He gave a small nod, I returned it, and then we both looked away, not because we needed to, but because we didn't. Time has a way of softening things, not erasing them, not rewriting them, but placing them where they belong. And as I sit here now, with my tea growing slightly cooler than I intended, I find myself thinking about all the things we leave unfinished. The words we don't say, the moments we assume will come later. The connections we feel but don't quite know how to step into. Sometimes life closes those doors quietly, without warning, without explanation. But sometimes, if we're fortunate, those doors open again, not in the way we expect, not in the time we imagined, but just enough to let something pass through, understanding, closure, or simply a chance to see things clearly at last. I never met Alina, not truly, not in the way we both might have hoped, but I knew her, in the quiet way that words allow. And in the end, that was enough. And now I find myself wondering something, not with regret, not with longing, but with a quiet curiosity. If you were given the chance to answer something you left unfinished years later, would you take it? Or would you let it remain as it was? If this story stayed with you in some small way, you're welcome to share your thoughts. Sometimes the things we carry quietly are the ones that connect us the most, and sometimes it's never too late to answer.